Hello, my name is Frankie Panzanella Goodrich, and today we're going to be talking about 2 Corinthians. Now, even though it's called 2 Corinthians, scholars actually believe this is the third letter Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. As evidence suggests, there was a letter written before 1 Corinthians that's been lost to time. After the first letter, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and now he's writing his third letter, what we call 2 Corinthians. In this letter, Paul addresses several issues the Church of Corinth is facing, some of which are issues Paul already addressed in 1 Corinthians and had to readdress in 2 Corinthians. These issues Paul addresses are divisions in the church, sexual immorality, and food that has been sacrificed to other gods. Firstly, there was division in the church because people were arguing and picking favorite leaders and saying those leaders were more important than other leaders while minimizing the importance of other leaders. Secondly, Paul addresses the sexual sin of a man who is sleeping with his stepmother. Finally, Paul also addresses the question of whether or not Christians can eat food that has been sacrificed to a pagan god. But in order to understand this book, we first need to understand the historical context of 2 Corinthians. Historical context is important because it gives us insight into the lives of the people Paul is writing to. There are certain things the Corinthians were dealing with that we've never encountered, so the importance of some of the issues Paul addresses can be lost on us. Understanding the world of the Corinthian church helps us better understand why Paul deals with certain issues the way he does, and why it's important to us today. See, the words only have meaning in context. We have to understand what God was speaking to the Corinthians before we can figure out what he is trying to speak to us. Corinth was originally a Greek city, and it prospered for hundreds of years. However, as Rome grew in power, it challenged Corinth. The Greeks tried to fight back, but in 146 BC, the Romans destroyed Corinth. The city laid abandoned for 100 years before in 44 BC, Julius Caesar rebuilt Corinth as a colony for free Italians. Caesar meant it to be like a bit of Rome outside of Rome. Though built on the ruins of the old city, this was, in some ways, a completely new Corinth. In fact, this new Roman Corinth was less than 100 years old when Paul first visited. Many freed men would come to Corinth to live. Corinth was a city of entrepreneurs, so these newly freed men hoped to make a life for themselves in Corinth. There was a mindset that you went to Corinth to make it big, to get rich. In that way, people viewed Corinth in the same way that many people throughout the years have viewed some American cities, like New York City. One thing that made Corinth so prosperous as a place for business was a combination of its location and a certain invention that made shipping much easier. See, Corinth was founded next to an isthmus, a narrow body of land that connected Corinth to a larger body of land to the north. However, the land to the south of Corinth was large enough that ships would have to sail well out of the way to get around it. This was especially problematic because the waters to the south were dangerous and ships would often get attacked when they tried to sail around. However, the isthmus Corinth was built on was only 4 miles wide. This was thin enough that some Corinthians thought to pull ships across the isthmus rather than sail around Greece. And so, the Corinthians invented the Diolkos, the first railway. It was a pathway made of stone that allowed the Corinthians to move small ships over land to the other side of the isthmus. This greatly shortened the journey ships would have to take and was a lot safer than trying to go around Greece. As a result, Corinth saw a steady stream of merchants and business people sailing to Corinth. This made it an important trading hub and a great place to do business. Corinth was also a highly religious city. In fact, in Corinth alone, there were 36 temples and shrines dedicated to various pagan gods, but there was one church. The two most prominent gods worshipped in Corinth were the Greek god Apollo and the goddess Aphrodite. It is believed there was a temple dedicated to the Greek god Apollo. Another temple was dedicated to the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Aphrodite was the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. The temple of Aphrodite was rich and had over 1,000 slaves, making it an influential force in Corinthian society. You could almost call Corinth the Romans' version of Vegas, partly because the worship of Aphrodite involved sex. Corinth was a city filled with sexual sin and greed, and they didn't see anything wrong with it. Their culture said what they did was okay. that sleeping with prostitutes and idolizing sex was completely normal. This was a city filled with darkness, but it had one light, and that light, as we see in Paul's letters, was struggling.